Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the second episode of the Seerah brought to you by EdTalk Islam. I am Asif Khan, your host and facilitator for this episode. Now, in episode one, if you remember, we looked at the 25 prophets mentioned in the Quran and we looked at the importance of the two children of Rasul Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, that is Hazrat Ishaq and Hazrat Ismail, and their bloodline and their family and children, which form the rest of the prophets that are mentioned in the Quran and beyond. Now, in Seerah episode 2, we're going to start by looking at the life of the Prophet, but before the life of the Prophet itself, we're going to look at the 100 or so years prior to this and look at the tribes of the Quraysh and Hashemites. And so we know that in episode 1 that Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam mentioned Kinana, in that Allah chose Kinana from the children of Ismail. And Kinana's bloodline, it follows through for several generations until the Quraysh tribe are formed. Now the Quraysh tribe is actually a number of different tribes coming together. The word Quraysh has had several different definitions, and two of them are quite important. One is that Quraysh means those that trade. And we know that the Quraysh were those who traded from Mecca to Yathrib and Sham and beyond that regularly. But Quraysh can also mean tribes that have come together after being parted, separated. And so some scholars have suggested this is the beginning, the coming together, the beginning of the coming together of the different tribes of the Arabian Peninsula. And so the word tribe in Arabic is Banu. So Banu Hashim is the first of the tribes we're interested in. And of these, we have Banu Makhzum, Banu Zohra, Banu Umayyah, and so on and so forth. Now, the one we're interested in the most is, of course, Banu Hashim, because Banu Hashim is the tribe where Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam comes from. And its name Hashim comes from from the great grandfather of Rasulullah, Hashim. And so we're going to spend some time looking at what this means. Now, the Banu Zuhra is important, of course, as well, because Banu Zuhra is the tribe from where Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's mother is from. And the Banu Makhzum is the tribe from some of the great enemies of Islam are from as well, like Abu Jahl, for example. Okay. So here, just a little bit of a graphic for you to get you thinking about what the Kaaba might have looked like at the time of the time period that we're looking at now. We know that the Kaaba didn't look like it does today. Today, it's much taller than it is or was then. Today, it's draped beautifully with a black cloth with gold woven into the fabric with beautiful inscriptions and so on. Whereas during the time of Hazrat Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, it would have very much been the case of a very standard looking building made up of sort of black stones, baked stones in the sun, with lots of different drapes and various cloths from the different tribes that lived in and around Mecca at the time. And this is a graphic that's been taken from the credits there. And of course, there would have been houses even closer than the graphic here suggests. People would have literally been able to open their door or through their window touch the Kaaba. That's how close they were. On the right hand side here, we notice that picture. Now, this picture I've taken myself while visiting Medina. This is the house of Sayyidina Ali and Hazrat Fatima Zahra. Now, they had two houses in Medina. One was located directly near the house of Rasulullah in the center of Medina, where the masjid is today, whereas this is now located outside a good half an hour camel trip. And it's still there, there for us and everybody else to see. It's been preserved. But it gives you a bit of an idea of what the stones would have looked like at the time when Sayyidina Ali and Fatima Zahra were living here. And it also gives you an idea of the sort of construction of the buildings of that time. Okay. So the tribes of Mecca lived in and around the Kaaba. So one section of this picture perhaps would have been a section where the Banu Zuhra lived, and one section where it was close to the Banu Abdul Manaf, and then Banu Makhzum, and so on. They all sort of lived in and around the Kaaba. So let's delve into what this actually means. So the Hashemite tribe, it comes from the great grandfather of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. His name is Hashim ibn Abdul Manaf, and he had a single child called Abdul Mutaalib. His actual name was Shayba ibn Hashim. So Hashim has a son called Shayba, but he will be known as Abdul Mutaalib for the rest of his life, and we'll come to that in a moment. Why? Well, it's very important that we understand where and how Shayba got the kunya Abdul Mutaalib. Before the purpose of this particular slide, I've highlighted for you the different uncles of the Prophet ﷺ and his father and his aunts. And these are the children of Abdul Mutaalib. Now, Abdul Mutaalib actually had 5 wives, possibly 6, according to some of the historians. And the people in green, of course, are those who accepted Islam or were on the correct religion of Ibrahim والسلام, and those in blue were never around, they never received the message. And of course we have one person in red, which is Abu Lahab, and Abu Lahab is actually Abdul Uzza. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind is that this bloodline of Hashim, it is known for its beauty. His children were beautiful. Abdul Mutaalib, in fact, in the historians say that he was one of the most beautiful Arabs ever seen. He certainly was the most well-known, the greatest Arab of his time before Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And Abdul Mutaalib is known for his striking beauty. And all his children were beautiful. And even someone as despicable as Abu Lahab had a beautiful physical attributes, but his actual other attributes, his understanding, his iman, his personality was disgusting. And it doesn't matter what your outsides look like, it's what you do on the inside that really counts here. So Abu Lahab, despite being a handsome chap, will be forever known as a disgusting human being. And Allah Ta'ala has promised to punish him in the hellfire. But all of the uncles of Rasulullah and aunts were all blessed with beauty, no more so than Abdullah. So of all the children of Abdul Mutaalib, Abdullah, the son, the father of Rasulullah would have the most beautiful attributes and characteristics physically, and he would then pass them on to his son, and his son is Rasulullah, who is the epitome of beauty in every single kind of way. So who is Abdul Mutaalib, and how did Abdul Mutaalib come around? And for this, we need to track back one single step, which is the life of Hashim ibn Abdul Manaf. So I've made it easy for you, hopefully, here, is that you need to know that the Prophet's great-grandfather, Hashim, was a trader, and he regularly traded. He bought and sold goods in Sham Sharif, in sort of Syria and Palestine and these sort of areas. And on one particular trip, he went to Medina, or then was called Yathrib, and he married a lady called Salma, and they had a child called Shayba. So Hashim has a child called Shayba with the lady called Salma. And while Shayba was very young and very much an infant, Shayba was still on his travels. He was in Gaza at the time when he passed away. So nobody really even knew that he'd married Salma, let alone had a child. Just the odd few people. Okay. Now Hashim has a brother called Mutaalib. Okay. Hashim has a brother called Mutaalib. And therefore, Mutaalib has a nephew called Shayba. All right. Now Shayba is going to be called Abdul Mutaalib. Later we'll find out in a moment. Now, what's important is Hashim passed away while Shayba was very young, and therefore Shayba remained in Medina, being looked after by his mother Salma. And only a few people knew that this was the case. Now, a few years later, whilst Hashim had passed away in a trading mission in Gaza, and he's still buried there today. Of course, if you go to Palestine, you'll find in Gaza an area known as Abu Hashim, or the area of Hashim, and you'll find his grave there. A few years later, a chap called Thabit bin Manzir visited Makkah, and he knew of Shayba, and he knew of Salma, and he knew of Hashim's marriage, and he came to Makkah. And at the time in Makkah, the person who was in charge of the tribe at the time was Mutaalib. And he told Mutaalib, look, your brother Hashim, did you know he had a marriage to a lady called Salma? They've got a child, and his name is Shayba. And of course, Mutaalib hears this information, and you can imagine he's absolutely excited about the idea that he has a nephew, and his brother his bloodline hasn't finished. In fact, he has a son of his. And Mutaalib is well aware that Shayba ibn Hashim, this young child, is the true heir of Hashim and would be sitting on his throne or his seat now that it's been vacated by Hashim. So what does he do? Well, Mutaalib, he visited Medina and he brought his nephew back to Makkah. So Mutaalib goes all the way to Medina, he meets Salma, he sees this boy called Shayba, and Shayba's got a striking look in that he had a particular type of white hair. This was a sort of a characteristic of the family of Hashim. They all had this particular sort of white hair and this particular type of beauty, and Mutaalib only has to see this child to know that this is absolutely the son of my brother Hashim. And so Mutaalib brings his child back to Makkah. And when they arrive in Mecca, you can imagine that people would have been delighted to see the son of Hashim, but there would have been some who would have been a little jealous. Why is this child sort of being portrayed as the next leader of our clan, our tribe? And so, for the boy's security and protection, um, the name Abdul Muttalib remained his name. Why? Because when Muttalib brought this child back to Mecca, people just assumed that he was a servant, right? They saw this little child on this camel. They said, okay, this must mean that Muttalib was brought to servant. And so they gave him this kunya, this nickname, Abdul Muttalib. And because it was better for the child's safety that people don't know that he's Shayba ibn Hashim, his name stuck. It was never challenged, never changed. And so for the rest of his life, Abdul Muttalib would be known as Abdul Muttalib, right? Yes, he would eventually become the leader of the tribe that his father was in charge of, but he would still be called Abdul Muttalib despite the fact that he had an actual name. And Abdul Muttalib would go on to become the single most famous Arab of his generation. Anyone who came to Hajj met Abdul Muttalib because he was in charge of the Banu the tribe that the Rasulullah came from, the Banu Hashim, or the Banu Abdul Manaf, the higher one in this. And people would meet Abdul Muttalib, they would be struck by his striking good looks, his status, his stance, his sort of stance, and his belief in serving people who came to do Hajj and Umrah. So that sort of gives you a bit of an idea of who Abdul Muttalib was. I'm going to now stop this episode and we'll pick up episode 3. And in episode 3, we'll be looking at 3 events that took place before the life of Rasulullah, before the birth of Rasulullah. And that is the rediscovery of the Zamzam well, the parents of the Prophet, and the year of the elephant, the year that Rasulullah was born. And so I wish you the very best, to make dua that Allah should open your hearts and your minds to the ilm of Islam and Iman, the love of Rasulullah become part of your daily routine, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fill your hearts with unshakable love for Allah and love for His Rasul and love for the Seerah. May Allah bless you all and bless me. Allah Hafiz.